Okay, we're going to get started. It's my honor and privilege today to fill in and introduce our speaker, Scott Kollins. And I would describe Scott as one of the more interesting men alive.
Wow.
He got some tough competition now.
Yeah, really.
He doesn't have a beard. He doesn't drink Dos Equis, but he's got it going. Dr. Kollins is a tenured professor and vice chair of research strategy and development in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health. Dr. Kollins was an undergrad here at Duke, went off to Auburn for master's and PhD, spent a few years in Western Michigan before coming back here. His work is remarkably actually under the radar in my general life, but as more and more I hear about it, I think, and you'll find today as you hear what he's doing, it's really cool stuff. And he does it with humility, with remarkable skills. He is sort of resetting the bar for how we ought to be doing research. And I'll do it just with that enough. I'll turn it over to him.
Wow. All right. Thanks. Very tough. Thank you very much, Eric. I think I've got a mic on, if he turns it on. Thanks, everybody, for coming out, and I will do my best to live up to the introduction, although I'll say I'll describe some of the ongoing work we are doing, both trials and psychology, a little bit about how health, I think, can help us, or it can help inform those endpoints in psychiatry. So I've been working at the DCRI now for a couple of years, and the first big study that I've been involved with as a PI is a multi-site study for pediatric indication for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So that's my kind of main clinical background. I'm the director of the Duke ADHD program. We see folks from preschool age through adulthood who are affected by ADHD. And this trial that we're working on it is very interesting. It's, to my knowledge, the first study that is seeking a device registration from FDA for a mental health condition. And we're well on the way of getting towards the end of the trial. And that the thing that's novel and innovative is that it's effectively a game. And the sponsor does not like to call it a game for a lot of reasons. So it's an app-based digital therapy for ADHD, but it's a game. And they are evaluating whether or not this game, via some changes in brain plasticity, can affect kids' attention in a way that's functionally helpful for them. So when I got involved with this sponsor, this really spurred my interest. I'm not a digital health researcher, and I know that there's folks here in the audience that know a lot more just in general about the sort of methodologies and so forth in digital health, but I've thought a lot about how improvements and advances in technology can really be useful for us as we think about some of the challenges that we face in developing treatments and developing clinical trials in psychiatry and mental health. So that's kind of the framework or the context. Just to talk about some guiding questions and overview here. First of all, to speak to the title, there are no standard endpoints, even though the title talks about that, because we don't really have very many trials. I think that it might be worth some discussion to talk about how we might get to the point of standardizing those. I want to set the stage. Hopefully I won't have to work too hard to do that, about why it's so important to innovate in terms of treatment development and to come up with alternative approaches or novel approaches to designing studies in psychiatry, but then really do a little bit of a breakdown of traditional approaches to clinical trials and endpoint selection in psychiatry, to help identify where some of our conceptual some of our conceptual gaps are, to help set the stage for them thinking about kind of the last point here is, where do we need to go? What do we need to be doing? And are there ways that technology and digital approaches might help us get there? So to just put some of this in context, we see lots of these numbers in headlines all over the place. May is actually Mental Health Awareness Month, so this is kind of apropos. Neuropsychiatric disorders cause an enormous amount of morbidity and mortality in the United States and globally. This is a study that was conducted through the World Health Organization. If you combine psychiatric and neurological disorders, they account for they're the largest bucket for disability in the world and also in the U.S. And then also just to throw out some other sort of I think highlights around or lowlights around the burden or the impact of mental health. Back in 2013, which is the last year for which we've got good data or up-to-date data, about 41,000 suicides in the United States, which is about the same number as people who died from breast cancer, 6 times more than the number of people who died from HIV, 3 times more than the number of people who died from homicide. So this is suicide alone. This doesn't count morbidity and mortality associated with other aspects of mental illness. And one of the big problems is that if you look across time, these cancer, HIV, homicides, these things in general, mortality from these conditions is going down. Mental health, suicide is not changed in decades in terms of the impact that it has on society. So the average reduction in life expectancy due to mental illness is about 10 years. And studies have suggested that we could avert about 350,000 deaths a year if people with mental illness just died at the rate of the general population. 350,000 lives. This is impactful. And one of the big problems that we face, as I just mentioned, is that we have not innovated and we have not improved over the last 30 to 40 years. I'll talk about this a little bit more as I go through the talk. So shifting gears a little bit, what can digital health tell us or how is it relevant for clinical trials? And there's a lot of different ways, and we can define and think about digital or mobile health in lots of different ways. But to sort of put some boundaries around the talk today, I want to think about the relevance of digital health in a couple of ways. First of all, it can allow us to do a better job of assessing things in the context of a clinical trial. So not new endpoints, but just maybe more efficient ways to gather those endpoints or monitor those across time. Or like we're doing with this app-based digital therapy trial, we can use technology to actually develop and validate new endpoints or new approaches to treatment. There are probably other ways or other ways. These things are not mutually exclusive by any means in terms of how digital health can be relevant for psychiatry clinical trials. So before thinking about sort of how we can innovate or the best ways that we can think about digital health as a way to help us innovate, I think it's useful to kind of walk through the standard approach and it's really been tried and true approach for treatment development and clinical trial endpoint selection in psychiatry. And because I think that in doing so, we can identify some of the big challenges for where we need to look in the future. So we start off by having a mental health condition, ADHD, which is what I know the most about, but depression, schizophrenia, substance use disorder, bipolar disorder. And you have a sponsor that might be interested in developing a treatment for one of these conditions, for developing a pharmacological treatment. Usually the pathway to sort of, or some of the assumptions that get made about treatment development for some of these conditions follow along a pretty predictable path. So first of all, you've got a compound that may have sort of known neuropharmacological effects on neurotransmitter systems that we know are implicated across a range of psychiatric conditions. These are just examples. This is kind of the triumvirate of neurotransmitter systems that are implicated in psychiatric conditions: dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. There are, of course, others, but just to illustrate. So a sponsor may have a new compound or an existing compound that has not yet been evaluated that they think might modulate activity of these neurotransmitters. Then there's an assumption or there needs to be a step in this pathway to say, well, okay, if we can demonstrate that there's neuropharmacological activity, then we need to know, does this actually play out in the brain? Does it actually do what we think it does at a receptor level? Or at a functional level in terms of brain activity. Then we take a pretty big step from demonstrating activity or success or proof of concept at that level to seeing whether this actually changes behavior or cognition in predictable ways. And this can be done in animal models, it can be done in proof of concept or laboratory-based human studies. But we still haven't quite gotten to the point where the treatment is having a direct impact on the conditions, the clinical things that the behaviors and the problems that we see patients coming into the clinic for. For that, we kind of make this big leap then to our standard clinical trial endpoints in psychiatry. So if you look across the vast majority of approved medications for psychiatric conditions, the primary endpoint in their pivotal trials is going to be some kind of a rating scale. It's a self-reported or a caregiver-reported symptom rating scales, and this is true for ADHD, it's true for depression, it's true for schizophrenia. These are our primary endpoints in psychiatry clinical trials. And what I would submit is, and this is recognized in the field, but this is kind of the way it's been done for many, many years, that the linkages between what we see in the clinic and the problems and the impairments that our patients come in and talk to us about, the linkages between those and the endpoints that we're measuring when we do a clinical trial are not that tight. And I'm going to highlight this point a little bit more. Some data on this just to illustrate the point. The writing is a little bit, you can't read this here, but these were some data that were pulled from a phase 3 trial of a recently approved ADHD medication. It's a stimulant medication. It's a novel formulation of methylphenidate. So what you're looking at here on the left here, as you're looking at it, the bars that are circled. This is all of the patients in this trial who met a pre-specified criterion for symptomatic improvement on that symptom rating scale. Okay, so that there was more than a 30% reduction in a scale called the ADHD rating scale. The blue, it represents those patients who, on a different measure of functional impairment, on how much those symptoms are actually affecting their, and this is in a pediatric population, how much is it affecting the kids functioning in school, with their peers, at home, et cetera. Only about 57% of those people who effectively met the endpoint had functional improvement. So a big chunk, 40+% of those patients who had symptomatic improvement did not have functional improvement. And if we look then to look at the patients who met a pre-specified criterion for remission, so now their symptom ratings are actually in the normative range for a kid that wasn't actually diagnosed with ADHD, almost 1 in 5 of those kids still didn't have functional improvement. Okay, so this is the mismatch between what we see in the clinic and what we hear in terms of impairments and the endpoints that we're using to measure outcomes in clinical trials. And there are a number of reasons, and we can kind of walk through the pathway to identify some of the ways in which variability and problems around how we're assessing things kind of get in the way. So starting off at the very first level, usually this is, especially if it's a compound that is known or that's been studied for some other kind of indication, this step is relatively straightforward, that based on the chemical structure of a compound, that it's probably going to have an impact on neurotransmitter functioning. And then even testing this to look to see whether this holds up in terms of binding profiles in the brain, neurotransmitter binding profiles, or functional activation. This can be pretty well established. This can be done in preclinical models, in vitro and in vivo animal studies, or also even in proof of concept human neuroimaging studies. You can give the drug, you can usually, with relatively low variability, look for predictable changes in brain activity, for example. But even at this step, even at this pretty kind of molecular, if you will, level of analysis, there's room for variability to creep in, and especially when we start talking about human studies. And in particular, the genetics plays a big role here. For example, lots of studies, I mean, we've characterized really well the binding behavior of stimulant drugs used to treat ADHD used in PET studies in humans. all right, and that's well worked out. But we also know that the binding potential of these drugs varies as a function of a person's genotype. There's also other studies showing that early life history can also impact binding profiles, and that association is mediated by epigenetic processes. So even this step, getting from a chemical entity that we think should have a specific effect on a receptor in the brain, there's variability when we take that out into people who have a widely varying genetic makeups in terms of how that drug is going to behave. When we then step to the next step in the pathway in terms of measuring effects of a treatment or a potential treatment on behavior or cognition, there's additional opportunities for variability to creep in. And what you might see in studies like this, if a new drug is being considered for treatment for ADHD, we might look to see does it have effects in laboratory-based measures of attention, either in animals or also in humans. There are other sort of laboratory-based measures that can be used to establish this. Now, of course, when we get into to measuring these kinds of things, or I should also say, we might also measure self-report. So we might measure the degree to which in a proof of concept study, a proposed antidepressant changes mood symptoms, and we're going to get that from the patient themselves. Of course, there's a lot of variability that we can introduce here. Patient biases can start to creep in. They may have expectations about what the study is about. There might be variability in terms of what those patients in those studies, or even in healthy controls, what they did the night before, what they ate for breakfast that day. So there's variability that's going to creep in that further separates the linkage between what we think is or what we know is a neuropharmacological mechanism and how that is going to affect the actual clinical phenomena that we're seeing in our clinics and in the real world. So as we make this step here then, and we conduct a clinical trial, and we set up our endpoints as these rating scales that I talked about before, you get even further away from the mechanism of action of the treatment and what's actually happening out in the world. And there's additional sort of complicating factors here. If you're going to do a blinded study, the potential for placebo effects. Placebo effects are notoriously high in psychiatry trials across the board. There's been there are some really interesting and novel approaches for trying to reduce that statistically and from a design perspective. But the bottom line is that the placebo effects that we see in psychiatry trials are a byproduct of the kinds of endpoints that we're using, that we don't have the kinds of hard targets that aren't going to be subjected to a patient or patient caregiver's kind of biases or perceptions. You've also got the problem of in most psychiatry clinical trials of the reporters having to integrate information over varying amounts of time. So for example, when we do an ADHD clinical trial for a new medication, pretty standard practice is they get randomized, they're on placebo or drug, they're going to come back for weekly visits. And each week we're asking the parent or the patient themselves for adult trials, we're asking them about their symptoms over the past week on one of these rating scales. And so you've got reporters, and again, all of those biases that I already mentioned, what they ate for breakfast, what they did the night before, there's recency effects. So you might have a kid who's had a really, really good week, except for that morning. And so what does the parent remember when they're reporting on this, the primary outcome measure for a clinical trial? They're going to be biased, and they're going to be remembering the kid's behavior that morning. So this introduces a lot of problems and a lot of variability into the system. So why do we stick with these endpoints if they're subject to so many biases, if they're problematic? Well, part of it is it's historical, and part of it is the fact that, or a large part of it is due to the fact that these endpoints in psychiatry clinical trials are anchored to our existing diagnostic classification system for psychiatric conditions. And so when a sponsor goes to seek approval from the FDA is going to define the condition or the endpoints of interest for the condition based on our existing classification system, which has been around for decades. It gets iterated every 10 to 15 years. The last iteration was a few years ago. But in general, our DSM, and some of y'all may be familiar with this, it's flawed from the standpoint of really describing conditions from a mechanistic perspective. It's completely descriptive. It's atheoretical, doesn't sort of take causes and mechanisms into play, and it as a result, what we have for all of our psychiatric conditions is incredible heterogeneity, and the linkage between the DSM sort of classification and the resulting endpoints that we get for clinical trials and what we actually see in the clinic is it's pretty loose. The clinical conditions, the behavior in general doesn't like to conform to nice little categories and boxes. And so there's lots of sort of squishiness at the boundaries in terms of defining these conditions, and that becomes challenging when we try to put boundaries around them for the purposes of good measurement in a clinical trial. So what are some ways then that we can start to think about innovation, both broad innovation around classification, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but also from in terms of thinking about how digital health approaches can help. So one way that I've sort of tried to think about this is that our current approach to measurement in clinical trials, it's really a question of clinical trials for psychiatry. That is maybe the case for other therapeutic areas. It's a question of precision and accuracy. So our traditional approaches to measuring endpoints using the ADHD rating scale or the MADRS or whatever, they are relatively precise. There are approaches. There are lots of there are companies that build their raison d'etre is to increase the precision of measurement for psychiatry clinical trials. So we can teach raters if they get the same information from somebody talking about their ADHD child, they'll rate them in the same way on the ADHD rating scale. So in that way, we can improve precision, but we're really still not very accurate because we're really not measuring the things that are causing that functional impairment that we're seeing in the clinic. Now, I think that digital health, this is one very easy and straightforward way, and I know it's being used in lots of other therapeutic areas. It's not being used, I think, in my estimation, quite as much in psychiatry clinical trials as in some other areas. But this is an easy way that we can overcome some of the challenges and some of the biases that I talked about a moment ago. So with digital health approaches, for example, instead of waiting a week before you're measuring the symptoms of a person in a clinical trial, you can get that information almost in real time. So you could be asking questions about symptoms on a day-to-day basis. That's one way that you can potentially improve or reduce some of the biases. Now, the problem, though, is that until we move away from this approach to classification, we're still sort of constrained to asking the same amount, the same questions and the same symptoms, and we're really not getting at mechanism as much. And so we may be improving precision. We might improve accuracy a little bit by getting a little bit more real-time assessment of some of those symptoms, but these changes are probably only occurring incrementally. So where do we go next, and what's how do we innovate in psychiatry in general and in psychiatry clinical trials? This is something I should say that the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health this was a problem that he tackled head on and was very sort of outgoing in terms of the approaches that he wanted to develop to address this problem that we've got continuing and not improving rates of morbidity and mortality of mental illness, and our treatments haven't changed in decades. And so he recognized the need really for a paradigmatic shift in how we think about and how we classify our psychiatric conditions. And so, and interestingly, in terms of the linkage between innovation in clinical trials in psychiatry and digital health, former director of NIMH went to work for Google. So he is now working at Verily and is really applying and merging these things together in a lot of the ways that I'm talking about. So Tom Insel is this person's name, along with some of his colleagues at the NIMH. They launched an initiative, and this is probably about 4 years ago now, called the Research Domain Criteria Initiative. The goal of which, like I said, was really to think about taking a different approach to classifying psychiatric illness that focuses on mechanism. And instead of taking a DSM approach where we're defining our clinical syndromes on the basis of just what we're seeing symptom-based, we want to define behaviors that cause problems in people's day-to-day functioning on the basis of mechanism. And this, not only from a conceptual standpoint that I'll walk you through in a couple of minutes, has this had a really, really big impact, and the impact, I think, is continuing to grow on our field. But at least while Insel was at NIMH, he made this, he sort of put the money where his mouth was, which was to launch a lot of funding opportunities that really promoted an experimental medicine approach to psychiatric treatment development, which hadn't been done before. And so a lot of work has gone into, or a lot of funding priorities have been shifted towards studies that do a few things. One, that measure quickly and do sort of quick, fast fail decision making. I think DCRI has been involved in some of those studies with Andy Crystal. There's also been a lot of work and a lot of funding that's been poured into not from a clinical trial sort of fast fail perspective, but from a just proof of concept, demonstrating that you've got a viable target that then might be developed for treatment. Duke's been really successful at at getting some of that funding to fund early stage work where there's a novel new target that it may be relevant for some psychiatric condition. So, for example, we have one of these grants where we're looking to see whether or not we can teach people to, on their own, without any medicine, whether they can activate a certain part of their brain that we know is implicated in ADHD, that we know that stimulants that are used to treat ADHD has a primary site of action in the ventral tegmental area in the brain, by giving them real-time fMRI feedback while they're in a scanner. So we think that this is a very, very relevant target for ADHD. We've got a couple of years of funding to demonstrate that we can engage the target with our intervention and show that there's at least a loose relationship between movement or change in that target and some kind of clinically relevant outcome. And then if we demonstrate that, then we get additional funding to start to do smaller scale clinical trials. And there's a lot of other examples. There's 3 or 4 more of those projects ongoing at Duke. But this is kind of the vision for moving us beyond a DSM-based approach to treatment development for psychiatry, and really thinking more from an experimental medicine, mechanistic approach to thinking about thinking about psychiatric conditions. So this has been in some ways a controversial initiative by NIMH because you can't launch something as grand as this without it being perfect. It reminds me a little bit of Obamacare. It was big and sweeping, but it wasn't perfect, and it causes lots of controversy. I don't think RDoC caused quite as much controversy as Obamacare, but nevertheless, it like I said, it spurred an awful lot of work and discussion. The basic premise of this approach, or this initiative, is, like I said, instead of thinking about psychiatric conditions from a sort of top-down, symptomatic, syndromatic perspective, it seeks to classify conditions or behavior along a number of different domains. And then within each of these domains, you've got subdomains. And these subdomains, these are areas that have been well worked out in animal studies and human studies. They have good neurobiological, we have a good understanding of the neurobiological underpinnings that sort of subserve these specific processes. Let me give you just an example of how we fit our current approaches to psychiatric classification or conditions into this new RDoC framework. So take ADHD, this the condition that I work with. This is a condition that we know from lots and lots of work has disruptions in attention. It's also got, it's characterized by disruptions in approach motivation. Kids are impulsive, and so the processes that are related to that are disrupted. So instead of thinking about the 18 symptoms in DSM that define ADHD, we're going to think about defining this in a little bit different way around how are attentional processes disrupted or affected, how are approach motivation processes disrupted or affected. And then for each of these different domains and subdomains, the idea, and this is where this is really built on a foundation of decades of work, behavioral and neurobiological work, we have a range of levels of analysis that we can measure and monitor across these different subdomains. And it ranges all the way from genes up through self-report and even sort of paradigms or sort of models, certain behavioral, laboratory-based behavioral models that are sort of well characterized as being part of certain psychiatric conditions. As this has been rolled out, and what at least NIMH has done is to force people to really start to think about how do the clinical features of the patients that I'm working with fit into this different framework, and how can we reconceptualize and reframe the questions that we want to ask, both to define the conditions and to do a little bit better job with that, but ultimately to come up with better treatment targets. Now, this is we're early in this process, but I think it has great promise. I think even now there's more acceptance in the field about the need for and even maybe not quite embracing this RDoC framework, but at least recognizing that something similar to it is absolutely necessary if we want to continue to innovate and improve our care of folks that suffer from mental illness. Now, one of the things, and this is where I see a lot of convergence. I mentioned Insel's departure from NIMH to Google. I don't think that was coincidental at all, because I think that as our technology improves and as this area of digital health advances, we are going to see lots of opportunities to make huge innovations in how we define and how we develop treatments for psychiatric conditions. So if you think about these different levels of analysis that have been proposed as part of this RDoC framework, we already, and there's already lots of work ongoing in digital health for being able to measure and monitor across many of those levels of analysis. We can certainly do monitoring of physiology, behavior, self-report, and paradigms in real time now, and collect lots of new information about that, and think about how those kinds of endpoints at those different levels of analysis might be better and more viable targets for intervention for psychiatric conditions. And it's not going to be too much longer, if it's not already happening and I'm just not aware of it, before we're able to similarly take leverage technology to take an approach where we can measure the activity of circuits, cells, et cetera, using mobile approaches. So I think that this is, I think that staying abreast of technology advances is absolutely critical for us. I think this is going to continue to move us in the direction that we need to go. I'll give you just an example of how we're thinking about this in my lab. So we've got a person that will be starting with us in August. We are hiring a fellow in digital health, specifically in ADHD. So we've got a guy coming in he's a PhD in systems engineering, and he's been working up at the University of Virginia, working on some really sophisticated approaches for combining data streams. He's been working with MS patients, but a lot of this is very applicable to what we have in what we see in the clinic with ADHD patients, trying to figure out and using some pretty sophisticated machine learning and other mathematical techniques to distill various data streams into coming up with the best way for each individual patient to ask them about their condition. In his case, they're measuring mobility and impairment, and they're using both the self-report of the patient, gait analysis, and a couple of other variables. I'm not sure, I can't remember what they're measuring. But I'm envisioning this really heterogeneous condition that we call ADHD, and being able to monitor or even measure behavior out in the real world, activity, maybe even physiology, and use that to refine the phenotypes that we're tracking to see how, for example, how do medications or other non-pharmacological approaches to treatment affect different kids based on a more refined view of their phenotype. So I think that there is, and this can be applied across the board in mental health. Now, one of the things that I think, this is last slide before I hopefully entertain some discussion, but I think one of the things that's really important, one of the things that I've learned working with this particular sponsor through DCRI, is that it's really important for us to think about collaborations, sort of across domains. This particular sponsor that we're working with, I was involved with them early on as we were designing the trial, and we went up to the FDA to talk about the trial design, as you would do for any kind of new treatment. And it was a fascinating experience because the folks that we sat with, because this is new and novel, they weren't quite sure what to make of us, and so, but there was phenomenal discussion, and I think that it led to what is hopefully a very solid trial design. But this is going to be somewhat uncharted territory where we're going to have to be somewhat making rules up as we go along. There's going to have to be, of course, not just from the sponsor side, but I think, as I mentioned and hopefully made the case for the involvement of the NIMH in terms of being able to fund discovery work that's going to really help to launch some of this stuff. So I think to emphasize that we're going to need to work on and continue to build good relationships across academia, industry, FDA, et cetera. So I think that was my last slide. Yeah. So thanks everybody for your attention. I'd love to hear reactions and questions and so forth. Thanks.
Yes. That was a great introduction. Could you dive a level deeper for, let's just take the issue that you primarily deal with. Obviously, as you go to digital measurements, you're going to have tremendous power because you'll be measuring things continuously that you could only measure periodically before. How do you see the other parts of clinical trials changing given the change in the dependent variables that you're going to see?
Which other parts are all of them?
Like, do you see much smaller sample sizes?
Will that be good, or is?
That's a good. I hadn't actually thought about that. I was going the other direction and thinking, concurrently with our ability to measure and track things continuously, we've got lots of innovation and advances in our ability to analyze big data and reduce it. But yeah, I hadn't thought about whether or not the required sample size to get there is obviously going to be smaller. So I guess the question also is related to if we get to a point. So where I think we're going to go with this to some degree is that the way that we think about indications is going to have to change. So ADHD is truly from a clinical perspective, it's messy. And so I think that what we might see is treatments that are developed for indications that aren't these big heterogeneous categories, but are more maybe lined up with these subdomains from the RDoC. And in doing that, sort of just walking through this, I think you may be able to demonstrate that on a smaller scale. It depends too on how you're going to define that a priori before you go into the study. So if you say we've got a treatment where we're going to, and this is kind of an extreme example, we're going to treat disrupted approach motivation. So we've got to be able to define that very clearly about who falls in that category and who might not. But I guess theoretically, you could get to a point where you could get that information and demonstrate it. I mean, in some ways, like you can do with very homogeneous groups of rodents when you're doing your proof of concept in animal work. So I think it's possible, but I think it'll depend on what the comfort level is, both of of clinicians, of the FDA, in terms of how much subtyping we can do from a phenotypic perspective. Yeah, Eric.
I was going to take us the opposite way, and we had this little debate even in your ADHD project that you had here. On the one hand, we develop for the FDA, and when we carry out studies, we're for NIH, where we define very, very clearly phenotype, and you take a lot of effort and highly specialized clinics and lots of testing to try to define this pure population of patients that have some condition, ADHD is an example, and you're sure that they have it, and then you look at a treatment and an outcome. And once that treatment gets approved, assuming that the study was successful, then it goes out into the real world, and it's used from everything from the mothers buying it on the street corners to whatever. That's reality. Whether that treatment would be either more or less or otherwise effective in various forms that might exist in this very heterogeneous world out there is unclear. So should in part our goal to be to actually enroll lots of patients across the entire spectrum, perhaps try to characterize them as best you can, but the realities are you want to get that huge spectrum and you want to see where this treatment is effective or not across that spectrum.
Yeah. So I think that two things come to mind on that. It's a really interesting point, and I think that the first thing is that I think that it's certainly possible and it's needed in the field, because like you said, when we do an ADHD trial, we have to get all these squeaky clean people that don't have comorbidities and that aren't over a certain weight limit, et cetera, et cetera. And even the people that use it clinically.
Why do you have to do that?
What's that?
Why do you have to do that?
The FDA.
I mean, my understanding, as I work with sponsors, is that is, if not required, strongly recommended. And I also think from a commercial perspective for the sponsors, they want to maximize the chances that they're going to get they want to get the signal to noise ratio as best as they can. And if you introduce a patient who's got another comorbidity, even though that's common out in the real world, that's going to introduce variability that might reduce your effect.
Yeah, so Eric and I are going in the same place with
Different, just asking from the opposite angle, which, what you described is what's going on. And it leads to a situation where you put things on the market with a label which may be totally irrelevant because it has nothing to do with the people who actually have the problem, as opposed to some rarefied group where you could show that a chemical has an effect in a very artificial situation.
On a rating scale, yeah.
And with a population which is just not representative of where the treatment is going to be used. So where I was going was you should be able to reduce the cost so much, because the cost of a lot of clinical trials is all the physical, come to a clinic and have an expensive person give these tests to people. You should be able to do much larger studies, even pre-market, and look at the heterogeneity as a factor as opposed to trying to eliminate it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I guess the challenge, I'd be curious what y'all think about this, because I think you can do that, and I think that as our technology gets better, we can do that more and more. There's a group I know at UCSF that's done a completely mobile digital intervention for depression. Enrolled everybody online, measured symptoms and so forth. But so I guess I would be curious to try to think about it from a sponsor perspective. Is what is the indication then that they're going to be able to go after, and how do they build how do they make that commercially viable if we want to say we're going to be able to treat this, and we can reduce the sample size small enough, or we can demonstrate that it's got that a treatment, a drug, has got effects in a small number of people, or I'm sorry, for a very specific process in a large number of people. I'm trying to think through what the business case of that is if we get too far away from having some predefined syndromes. And
I absolutely think we've got to get away from the way that we're classifying our psychiatric conditions. But where you guys are going with the question, I'm just curious, where does it stop?
That's why we need leaders, is I don't think anyone can define where it's going to shake out.
Yeah.
But, at least for me right now, the baseline assessment for mental health issues probably should include a provider of some kind in the mix. But I think the follow-up has become so onerous and expensive that it's leading to trials which aren't very helpful. And let's just be honest, the commercial route for mental health drugs has been do a stupid study for a short period of time, show that there's a signal, and then have an enormous marketing force that convinces people to use it, having no idea what the real effects are on the population over time. That seems to me like a bad way to do things.
Yeah.
So I might say that this is not an either or. We obviously know there are steps in a process, and it might be reasonable at some point in time to study a very pure population in a slightly artificial setting to determine whether there's a signal there that you can tease out, and in part maybe correlate these things better. But when it comes to the generalizability parts of it and use in the real world, this is where, in part, payers to some extent actually do crack down and are reasonable sometimes. They might say, this is what the study was actually approved in, so you've got to be seen by a psychologist at a specialized center to be able to be diagnosed before you can get access to the therapy. Now that may seem draconian, but it also, in certain ways, may be a control of a technology and an encouragement back to the sponsor that would provide your commercial interest. Yeah. If now you had to test it in people who were quote unquote real world and you put it out and did internet recruitment and got people in the study and then showed an effect in a larger, much more generalized population, or didn't, that would be very helpful to try to drive market share.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It's,
If the sponsors and many of the companies, there's been a big exodus in mental health in the last 10 years because, like to y'all's point, it's so expensive, and the signal to noise ratio is hard to find as it is, and for all these reasons, it makes me think that if we step away from thinking just about pharmaceutical development too, like this, if we think about other novel approaches to treatment, this app-based treatment. I've been talking with the sponsor because they're sort of locked in this, well, not locked, but they're in the mindset of thinking about what's going to happen if they get approval. And because they're also in uncharted territories as they're talking to payers, as they're talking to providers, how are we going to get providers to write a script for a game? And how are payers going to approve that? And so one of the thoughts that I had was, well, do you need that? And this brings in the question of the risk of the intervention. But if you've got a minimal risk device, if you've got a game that kids are going to, it's very similar to something that they're doing anyway, is that even a route that you need to go? And can you make that? And what are the trade-offs from a commercial perspective if you could go straight to the consumer, or if you come up with an alternative model for getting that out to the patients? But I think that one of the interesting things, what made me think about with your question, Eric, was just thinking about demonstrating effects of any kind of intervention on a more circumscribed process like attention, which is what this game that this sponsor has been working on. It opens the door to measure that en masse, and then try to figure out what do you do with those data, and how do you translate that into something that's both clinically useful and commercially viable. So
Yeah, so Dr. Kollins, this is a fascinating presentation. Have you or your colleagues thought about moving into other areas of medicine with some of this technology? Because, when you think of human diseases, there's a lot of functional impairment, heart disease, cancer, eye diseases. It's all, as a clinician, you're looking at function, and you're trying to figure out, okay, how can I measure it? Like in oncology, we have this whole concept of performance status, you know? And we kind of grade someone's ability to function based on these certain clinical steps or functional steps that they can do at home. And that's been around for, 60 years, 70 years. I mean, it hasn't changed. And so I'm sitting here wondering, how can you measure functional improvement, after hearing your lecture, with other measures that are not so subjective and so biased as you were pointing out. So this is probably pervasive throughout medicine. And so my question again to you is, are you or your colleagues, on a national scale, trying to expand some of these ideas, these concepts in psychiatry to other areas of medicine?
Yes, the short answer is yes. I mean, we're not doing it. I mean, I know that I'm always a little surprised and maybe reassured, maybe not, when I talk to other clinicians in other areas, because I always think that in psychiatry, we're the worst in terms of this mismatch between impairments and what we know about mechanism and the targets that we have for our studies. And I'm in talking with other people like you just described. We're not unique in that area. It's true in oncology. It's true in endocrinology. It's true in neurology. So there is an awful lot of work. I know there's work ongoing here, both at DCRI, but also more broadly at Duke, in the area of digital medicine and sort of innovating assessment and how we think about and how we define the measurement of impairments and things like that. So I think that this is, and I tell you, one of the things that I've observed about here at Duke is we have, there's a critical mass here, and I think that it's sort of moving in the direction of convergence. And I've seen it in the short time that I've been here at DCRI, but also throughout the rest of the community, that there's some really, really fascinating and innovative stuff ongoing that I hope we keep seeing this movement in the direction of, sort of joining forces to work together on some of these problems, because I think there's absolutely lessons to be learned.
I can't resist, David. You could even sign up for one of the Vanguard efforts. This study called Baseline, which Duke and Stanford are running. For example, has a watch that measures 17 physiologic parameters constantly. And you even get a little ring that goes under your bed so you can find out how you're sleeping if you want to know that. Some may not.
Terrible.
But yeah, this whole area is moving quickly across all areas because functional status is so important, and people know that periodic clinic visits with trying to recall what happened is not really the best way to measure a lot of things.
Yeah, Scott, this was such a great presentation. I have about 40 things that came to mind, but I'll pick my top one, and that is, it seems like the measurement strategies that you're discussing have the potential to chasten efforts to identify underlying biological mechanisms for some of these conditions, and the ability to highlight or discover more reliable temporal variability within person, because right now, we've got recall measures of it, and it sort of gives a falsely static picture of the person. And in other domains, when you do these momentary assessments and things, the intra-person variability is just astounding, and it's a parameter it doesn't seem like we're studying very much. And the other thing that the digital measurement seems to really highlight is the person's real day-to-day functioning, which is so far downstream from the mechanisms we're talking about, and it's downstream where other individual characteristics and features of the environment loom much larger in a lot of cases. And so I'm just wondering whether as a result of all the cool work going on, we do these measurements, it'll cause us to be perhaps more humble about efforts like RDoC, where, yeah, maybe we've identified something, but it's a 3% of the variance when we're talking about real outcomes in real time.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the things that I think, one of the things that RDoC has certainly been criticized for in mental health, I'm sure you know, is it's overly mechanistic, and you basically, you're looking downward, down the scale of levels of analysis, right? And so but I do think that, I can think of a couple of examples of people that are thinking about this where you can take into consideration, even beyond the individual, you can take into consideration interpersonal environment and context and factor that into all these other sort of streams of data that you might be getting. There's a group at Mass General that has a project where they're following like a very small, like a dozen folks with bipolar disorder, but they are getting 1,500 data points a day on everything that these people do, everything about their physiology, and then they're trying to take the big data sort of approach to reducing that and understanding and predicting things. But is that kind of what you're getting at? Is how do you lose the environmental influences if you're only measuring all these things from a...
I guess I'm saying to the extent that you're measuring the person's real day-to-day activities, you have the potential to even more see, you're measuring reliable variance that is more explained by, I'm saying we were getting a bit of a pass when you had people come in and recall stuff or what. The biases there, you said they were a pain in the neck for placebo effects, but they're also pretty convenient for trying to get a signal-to-noise ratio in a psychiatric trial in terms of presenting a false static picture that's dependent too much on the individual. So I don't know whether that's what you find, but I'm just saying we have the potential by indexing more of that reliable variance in day-to-day life to see that even less of that variance is explained by our upstream mechanisms.
Yeah, and I think that could help accelerate the development of new treatments too, because that's where I see that going. So, thanks everybody.
Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
One announcement for those who attended, that the director will soon have a monitor under his bed so you can tell how well I've been sleeping. Very valuable.